Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese, and thank you for joining me. As always, on the other side is Mr. Jeff Abercrombie. Jeff, your 49ers are playing right now. Week 4 of the NFL season's concluding. Week 5 of the college football is in the books. How are you doing this evening?
It's been a pretty good weekend, albeit a full one. And, I'm kind of burning the candle on both ends, especially on the home front this week, as Ashley's in your backyard in New York. And I've got Neely at home, who's coming down with yet another baby bug and probably getting the whole house sick again. So
Yeah,
it's never ending with them, right?
Yeah, those baby bugs. Once the kids are, in daycare and stuff like that, it's a never-ending cycle. And if Matt was here with us tonight, he'd be saying the same thing with Bree in his household. He's been dealing with it on and off, since the first one, the second one, the third one. It never ends on the home front. That is for sure. But let's take our mind off of that and talk some football. Another exciting weekend of college football in the books. Why don't you kind of just kick it off for us in the NFL draft stock report for this week? Some names before we dig in a little deeper into some prospects, some new guys that we haven't talked much about this season. Maybe it's a little rundown of some names and some of good performances from this past weekend and some notable injuries.
Yeah, we'll try this structure again where we do like just a quick 2-minute drill, and then we'll dive in deep down a couple names. And then, I'll just give the listeners like a preview. There's a watch list that I have ongoing, and we have a little Google sheet. We just keep tracking on it. And I want to mention these names for them at the end of this segment. So, it's on their radars too. But let's start with a quick 2-minute drill. We had 2 quarterbacks go down in game to injury this weekend. Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, both left early mid game, and both teams won, and it doesn't seem like the injuries are expected to be significant, so we'll keep an eye on that. But they should be back this season. They should be back soon. We also had really good games from the names we've been talking about all year so far. Sean Tucker, he had an injury scare of his own. Blake Corum, who's dominating the Michigan backfield. Deuce Vaughn, Zach Charbonnet, and of course, Bijan Robinson all had 100-yard good games. So we've talked a lot about them. They're worth mentioning there, but why don't we go into some of the names that we're actually targeting this week? And why don't we leave it off at the quarterback position with a guy I know you like, Jaren Hall?
Yeah. And what's nice to see is, we do this. We put these lists together. We do the NFL, the scouting notebook and the summer preview shows, and and then like the year kind of starts, and like then you start hearing a lot more from the big draft media, right? Like during the summer, you see watch lists, you see a little bit of bits of information here. The Devy community is always going strong, but then as the year really goes on, you start hearing more from the Daniel Jeremiahs and the Bucky Brooks and the McShays and the Kuipers and the Matt Millers and other people, who, have, Dane Brugler, who have boots to the ground, like ears, connections. And when you start to hear guys generating buzz from the NFL circles, it kind of gets you excited, especially when it's a guy you're intrigued with. And Hall is that guy so far at the quarterback position. We talked a little bit about Cameron Ward last week, but Hall is really starting to gain some buzz and generating some buzz that, I think it was McShay this past weekend was talking about how, like, after like the Stroud and the Bryce Young, it's kind of really up for grabs. And Hall is a guy who's making some noise. Every time I watch him play, he's not Bryce Young, but he does a lot of the same things as Bryce Young. Like he's almost like the 75% of Bryce Young version. He throws with good touch and anticipation. He's athletic, but he doesn't look to utilize that if he can avoid it. I think he's a little bit more athletic than Bryce Young, but I do think Bryce Young has got some untapped athleticism as well. He just looks to pass first. I think Hall the same thing, but he's a little bit more willing to run when he needs to, but it's not like a primary part of his game, but it's in the repertoire, almost like Russell Wilson in the NFL, right? Like he's never been a guy who wants to run, but he will when he can. I think Hall has that in his arsenal of tricks. I like the accuracy. I like the ability to move around in the pocket. This past weekend, 274 and 3 touchdowns. it's not even so much the statistics. We've seen Zach Wilson, from BYU, rise up the draft boards. And I don't think Hall is going to push all the way up to, where we saw Zach Wilson. But I do think there's been a somewhat constant, steady drumbeat so far in the early going of the college football season that he seems to be generating a little bit more buzz every single week. And you're starting to hear about him more from the media guys in terms of the draft circuit. And I'm kind of excited by it because I do think it's up for grabs after the first couple of quarterbacks. And he could be a guy that maybe is a day two, type target for some teams and get a real opportunity. So he's probably the quarterback I'm most excited about right now in terms of guys that I think are making a move in terms of where I thought they might have been before the season started. And I think BYU is going to be a really strong team. They're not going to be put in a lot of disadvantageous situations, I think, the rest of the season. So I think he's going to put together a really strong year. It's going to be interesting to kind of see what the NFL thinks of him. Any thoughts on Hall, Jeff, before maybe we take it to the next quarterback, who is really a new name to the show?
Yeah, and I think, Hall's one of those names that, we didn't highlight, but is been on that watch list when you dive in and you're watching a different quarterback or a different team, a different player, and then he's playing and you kind of get your eyes on there and you're like, oh, I think for me it was with Kansas State or something like that with Deuce Vaughn. But with as much as Zach Wilson is maligned, he is a number 2 overall pick and NFL quarterback right now. And I mean, I think, even if you wanted to make that comp from play style, for example, I think there's a lot more nuance that's going to be very different between these two players. But, like you said, a little bit like Bryce Young, right? We see a lot of these quarterbacks kind of model their games and channel their Patrick Mahomes, right? And play off the run and use their legs and athleticism to, create a little bit more versatility for their games. Even if you were going to kind of say that, like that was a first round pick in the NFL draft, right? So I think I think Jaren Hall would be just doing backflips if that's where he, got to as a player so far. And that just being able to get that opportunity. And, I'm with you. I don't think we're going to see that the drumbeat grow to the same extent that we saw for Wilson. But, remember, we sat here basically a year ago today talking about Wilson and talking about maybe his ceiling being that of a high second rounder if a team falls in love with him. And, a team really fell in love with him and the whole draft process really just kind of grabbed onto him and he took a rocket ship to the moon and went number 2 overall. Like, we could sit here right now, but all it takes is one of those teams. And when you talk about the draft buzz and the draft media starting to pick up on a guy, it usually comes from, those with a little bit of sources. Maybe there's a leak of a scout's, review or some owners got their ears out or eyes out and see something there. And usually, there's a little bit of buzz that comes around with that. And at that point, who really knows, right? I still think I still maintain Zach Wilson didn't have the number 2 overall, talent as far as the pick in that draft, but that doesn't mean that's not where he's not going to go, right? So with Jaren Hall, I think what our takeaway really is just, you've got to keep your eyes on him, and not just your eyes on him, but really your ears out and open on the buzz of what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. And, when you watch him play again, we're not going to see him in a lot of moments where I think he's really pushed, which is unfortunate. Like, we do like to see those, like even like in the Bryce Young game against Texas, he was terrible, for like 3.5 quarters, but then like you saw him get pushed and then like he had to respond, right? Like, unfortunately, we won't get to see Hall probably in too many big moments like that to kind of see how he responds. But he does have like this poise about him that I am intrigued with. And it's going to be interesting to kind of see, how high he could ride, that wave of momentum. So, Jeff, why don't you take it to the next guy? I have some thoughts on him, but why don't you kind of introduce him as well?
Yeah. So, out here on the Pac-12, we play way late at night. Well, we also have to wake up at 6:30 a.m. to remove Kamara from our lineups in the morning. So at least we don't have to watch 2 a.m. football like you guys do if you try to get eyes on the Pac-12. But I'm talking about Michael Pennix, who last week, 33 of 48 for 345 yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's a big-armed quarterback out of Washington, 6'3", 220. Why don't you go in? It looks like you got a bit of eyes on him, a little bit of a scouting report. What's your thoughts on Michael Penix?
Yeah, so I did get a little bit, not a deep dive yet, not enough to want to feel comfortable putting him in the notebook, but some initial takes. He's a guy, once I start adding some new names to the notebook, he's probably right at the top of the quarterback list that, and your boy, why am I drawing a blank, from out there as well, who McShay was talking up last week. I'm drawing a blank.
The Fresno State guy?
Yeah, Fresno
Jake
State.
Haener? Yeah, he's hurt right now too, though.
Yeah, but just in the overall, Pennix and Haener are probably 2 guys that'll be added to the notebook, before the end of the season, or if not, definitely right in the start of the pre-draft process. But in terms of Pennix, you mentioned it. Great size and frame at 6'3", 220. He's got a big arm. He's willing to put the ball into tight windows. He throws with good velocity. He's willing to make those NFL throws outside the numbers, deep, in the middle of the field, pushing it all the way down the field and into those tight spots. To me, there's still a lot of development needed in terms of the quarterbacking, in terms of, progression reading and some decision-making things. But I think he's a very toolsy prospect. He's dealt with some injuries, which is, we never kind of fully seen this develop yet. But I think he's putting it together this year, and he's showing the glimpses that you need to really start to generate that buzz like we were talking about. And when you have the prototypical size and frame, and when you have the arm talent, that gets you on the radar a lot easier than the non-ideal measurements. It's not like that's we've seen plenty of outliers and non-ideal measurements go early in the NFL draft. So, but let's not kid ourselves. Like, NFL teams still in a perfect world would love their quarterbacks to be 6'2" to 6'4" with a power arm, right? Like, that's still the prototype, right? When we see Baker Mayfield get passes knocked down, when we see Kyler Murray get passes knocked down, when we see at times Russ Wilson, struggling from maybe inside the pocket when he's not moving around, there's still a reason why in a perfect scenario, the size, the frame, the big arm to put it in tight windows, that's still what they ideally would want. It's not that's the only thing they want anymore, but it's still what they ideally want. So he has some of those ideal characteristics that now he's on the radar. And if he continues to put forward this really impressive year, and he's not generating a ton of Twitter buzz yet, and I think it's probably because what you talked about, right, on the Pac-12. It's just, Twitter's a lot different during the day on Saturday and at the 8 o'clock Eastern time, primetime games, than it is 11, 12 o'clock at night. So I think you're starting to hear about him a little bit more. I think it was last week on the Draft Stock Exchange podcast, over at PFF, and Connor and Trey brought him up. So he's definitely starting to get some recognition out there. And I think he's another one because of the traits, because of the big arm. If he can make it through the year healthy and continue to put up the numbers he's putting up, I think you're going to start seeing him on lists in like top 10, top 8, quarterbacks, which is going to start putting him in the mix now with some of these other guys. And we've seen some guys fall every time guys fall, that means some guys usually rise up in rankings. And I think that's what we're starting to see here. If a guy like Van Dyke is falling and doesn't declare because he's only a redshirt sophomore, who are some of the names that now are thrust into that? What if Anthony Richardson decides to go back to school for another year, right? So it's like this ebb and flow process. And if those guys don't come out this year, or their play, doesn't warrant them being, top 50 or top 100 picks, well, then are some other quarterbacks then thrust into the mix. And I think guys who are very traitsy, like Pennix, and some other intriguing guys, Hendon Hooker, even though he's a little bit older, those guys get put into the mix a little bit, and it opens the door for a guy like Jaren Hall, different style player, to also, climb up draft boards.
Yeah, and like maybe just a final thought here. I mean, he transferred out of Indiana where he hadn't ever played more than 6 games in a season, right? That's where all those injury concerns potentially come from. But that's also another reason why he, again, seems like he flashed in those games a bit. I do remember hearing his name, watching him a few times, a couple years prior, right? I just don't think that excitement ever got a chance to build enough momentum when you can't string together more than, half a season to really get started. And so, and again, now you're playing in the Pac-12 where, again, like you said, the eyeballs just aren't there, at least on the Twitter side of things. And so that buzz just doesn't get fully generated. But, you mentioned that maybe there's some development to go, and maybe that's because you just didn't get enough reps in the first 4 years of his career, but that's a little bit of a concern for a guy who's a fifth year guy. But I think when you start to maybe finally dig down and you get in the head of the quarterback, when you actually sit down and do tape, not just watch the games or watch the replay of the games, but really sit down and break the play down by, frame by frame almost. That's when that's when you can start to maybe not see as big of a gap between a guy like Pennix and a guy like, say, Will Levis, who's, just recent mock draft was put 1 overall, right? Like we always talk about those early mock drafts, they can look a little bit silly when we look at them in hindsight. And so I think that's something to really keep an eye on as we go forward, especially if he continues to, really carry a program. Washington itself is, was getting some love as far as like the rankings go, I think, as as the college season wore on, although they did just suffer the upset there. So we'll see if they still have, a little bit of a profile in the eyes of college football rankers. Why don't we go on? We've got a few names on the running back side. Surprise, surprise. It's been a pretty phenomenal running back class, but we've even got some new names to touch on. An old name, one of our favorites to go to, Jahmyr Gibbs. Haven't seen him dominate on the ground for Alabama. He's been pretty heavily involved as a pass catching weapon, as a lot of their other receiving weapons haven't really stepped up. But Bryce Young goes down to injury, and Gibbs needs to shoulder the load. And 18 carries, 206 yards, 2 touchdowns. 2 of those were 70-yard carries where he showed burst, and people question his athleticism or long speed, but he made 70-yard touchdowns outrunning DBs too. Did you have any further thoughts on Gibbs here?
No, I mean, I think he just continues. What's exciting about Gibbs is by transferring to Alabama. I know in the Devy community, he's been a guy that we've been talking about for a long time. But the common NFL fan, like the draft fan that comes to the party a little bit late in the game and doesn't follow the Devy circuit like we do and so many people do, might not have been too aware of Jahmyr Gibbs, but by now playing at Alabama, it's kind of opened the floodgates for him to get the national attention that he deserves. And now you don't have to worry about people maybe looking at statistics or lack thereof at Georgia Tech. He's now going to have the ability to put up some really gaudy stats on top of just his traits and his ability to impact the game in a variety of ways. And, and you said it from the first time you watched Bijan, like, could anybody close the gap? And I think Bijan is still going to go one when push comes to shove, because I think Saquon is kind of reminding people like certain rare talents and traits in terms of athleticism and stuff. It's still, if you put it all together, that like Saquon is currently doing this year, like he did his rookie year, I still think that stands out. But at the same time, versatility and the ability to be impactful as a runner and a receiver, I said it a couple weeks ago, and I stand by it. To me, the perfect comp for Jahmyr Gibbs is Austin Ekeler. Ekeler doesn't have this blazing speed or athleticism. It's good. I think that's what Jahmyr Gibbs is. But Jahmyr Gibbs is a good runner. He's a patient runner. He's a great receiver, just like Austin Ekeler is a great receiver. And he might not have the size that you look at that you're like, oh, he's a workhorse at the NFL level. But Austin Ekeler has shown that you don't have to have certain sizes. You could still be a workhorse in a different type of role, right? It might be 6 receptions a game and 12 or 12 carries, maybe not 30 carries like Saquon had this week, or we've seen Derrick Henry or something like that. But I do think Jahmyr Gibbs is starting. At this point, I don't really know if anybody else should really be in the conversation, for RB2. I mean, I know I'm a big fan of A-Chain and that blazing speed, so maybe him for some teams if that's what they're looking for. Maybe, but I think, and we'll talk about him in a few minutes, guys like Zach Evans and Tank Bigsby, I don't think they're right now in the conversation of being that guy that could maybe nip at the heels of Bijan. And maybe you have something like a Kenneth Walker, Breece Hall, where they go within a few picks of each other and there's almost no separation. And I'm sure Kenneth Walker was the number 1 running back on some teams' boards. There might be some teams that prefer Gibbs to Bijan. And that might be the way. It might end up being Bijan going 1, but I could see totally down the line somebody takes Jahmyr Gibbs and we hear after the fact that he was the number 1 back on their board. I just think he's a very complete running back that just does a lot of really things well and is a great, great receiver. And I think some teams will really, really value that component, maybe even more than the straight tools or athleticism of a guy like Bijan.
Yeah, and I'm with you because, I mean, if I were to only do size athleticism measurables as maybe a threshold criteria and not really kind of give extra credit for, maybe some elite types of traits that you'd see with a guy like Bijan. I mean, it's not that Gibbs is very lacking, maybe in the frame size department, but if we use that as a threshold and we talk about the skill displayed on the field, Gibbs would be my number 1 guy. So I wouldn't take it away. And I kind of stand by my comp earlier of when we talked on the preview show with running backs, Alvin Kamara, because that contact balance is again just one of those things that just showed up again last weekend. Several runs. I mean, one of his first runs, he was wrapped by a D lineman with a hit by a linebacker, and he somehow breaks that tackle, gets outside, and gets 5 more yards. I mean, that's rare. That's rare level contact balance. But even just beyond that, once just more things that I know, as he gets reps in Alabama, he gets a new environment, he gets to develop his game a little bit further. And you see some explosion and acceleration that may have been underappreciated or not able to be evident at Georgia Tech. But then just his innate nature of the way he plays the game, the way he's able to understand all parts of the field, all moving parts together at once. He has this timing and pacing of his runs that just looks advanced level. Whether that's a cutback, whether that's, just patience, just taking a couple extra steps, letting his O-line, play cat and mouse with the linebacker, letting his O-line advance and just suck him into the blocks and then burst around off tackle to gain, 8 yards on 2nd and 3, at the goal line. This was just the types of plays evident in this last game in a big matchup and when his team needed him. So I'll take that note of just that absolute love with Gibbs. And I want to tie us back to a new name that we haven't talked about. And that's Chase Brown, who currently is the college football rushing leader at 733 yards. So, I mean, that's an impressive accomplishment in and of itself. He's 5'11", 205 out of Illinois. Last weekend, he had 25 carries, 129 yards, 1 touchdown. Paul, you mind if I just kind of go straight into, I watched one of his earlier games that had gotten cut up, and I actually have some concerns. I know we're bringing him up here, and I think we should because of this name. But when I talk about someone like Gibbs, and I watched Brown first. I didn't watch Gibbs first. It's just that the evidence was sort of stark once I kind of watched Gibbs afterwards. But I even noticed just off the start here that he has some tools, and the reason and that's the reason that he's leading rushing right now, but they're not planned out. The mental side of his game hasn't fully arrived yet. And I think if it does, he's a special prospect, but it's not quite there yet because he's a very reactive player. And that's how I laid it down, is he's a reactive runner. And that stems from awareness concerns, whether that's recognizing backfield penetration and having a plan even before he takes the handoff. Usually he's kind of like a computer processor, where it's, what's the next task? Take the handoff. What's the next task? Avoid this backfield. What's the next task? Find this hole. What's the next task? Oh, the hole's clogged. Do something else. And so he's not really processing all of the pieces and the whole picture moving at once. He's taking one problem, finding a solution in that problem, and then putting his, like, you can even see this on the field as he runs, puts his head up, looks around, takes in the next picture of the field, does that again, rinse, repeat. And I think if he goes back to school, I think if he gives it a little bit more time to learn, because his first highlight play, he stays tight, he hits off tackle going downhill, breaks just stiff arms a safety straight into the ground. There's tools there. There's really something exciting there. And I think there's a lot of people who are going to like it. But I have to see kind of the mental side of the game first.
Yeah, he was a guy that I had on my watch list when I watched 20 guys before the season started for the scouting notebook. He was one of the few names that I had put on the watch list, as right on the rankings notebook. If you see where the draft eligible rankings are, underneath is a watch list of like 10 other running back names, and he was on the list. Didn't get a chance to watch him in the summer, have seen him sparingly, just in watching games on Saturday. And I know the stats are gaudy, but some of the concerns you bring up, I do think they're legitimate concerns. Haven't done a full deep dive yet to really feel comfortable, analyzing him at a much deeper level. But the stats he's putting up, like, that's kind of what we talk about here, right? Like, this is an evolving process, and we're a small operation here that, we don't have eyes on everybody. It takes time. But when you put up those type of stats, right, the antenna goes up. It's like, okay, we got to kind of watch him, right? And now he's a guy that, if I'm going to add a running back to the scouting notebook, it's probably going to be the guy who's leading college football in rushing yards right now, right? So like he's going to be one of those guys that we watch early, and maybe we're a couple weeks away from maybe us picking 4 guys and us doing one of our deep dive episodes, and maybe he's the running back that we kind of circle for that and do a deeper dive on that. And, maybe we pick a quarterback, a running back, a wide receiver. And that's, the bulk of the stock report that day is just doing a deep dive on a couple prospects like that. So I think what he's doing is impressive. I don't think he's a guy who's going to catapult himself into the mix of being like a day 2 type guy. I think this is a strong draft class. I look at it and I think, man, I see 8 guys already that I think are all going top 100, and that's probably unrealistic. But that's what I see already at the running back position. 8 guys who I think should definitively go in the top 100, and that would be a monster running back year. So then, then it becomes, well, can he add himself to that early part of day 3 mix? because we know we're seeing that this year, right? With Damien Pierce, right? It's still a pretty, I mean, it's a viable draft stock now. You go round 4, you're going to get a shot in most times in the NFL, because round 4 is a pretty good round still for running backs. And Damien Pierce is starting and is looking good. And other guys in that 4th round are going to get an opportunity. Maybe Jahmyr White next year, if they move on from Josh Jacobs, who's going to make that decision a little bit harder now. But, so these guys that we're talking about, Brown, and we've talked about Ibrahim in the last couple episodes, like, can they push themselves into that early day premix? Because that does then give them a legitimate opportunity to have a little draft capital attached to them at the running back position. But Brown's a guy I kind of look forward to digging in a little bit further, especially after, you kind of talking about him a little bit in the one, film study you got to do on him. But he's a guy that definitely want to do a little bit of a deeper dive, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, another name who might fit that bill of, trying to charge up the day 3, maybe into the late day 2 draft board is Chris Rodriguez Jr., who, had a little bit of an NCAA issue, delayed his season. He made his debut last weekend. I was pretty intrigued by what we saw on tape as like a deeper guy that we looked into during our preview shows. 19 for 72 and a touchdown, 3 for 40 through the air. So he was getting it done and being a big part of the offense. We'll kind of keep going rapid fire unless there's something that you want to key in on, and I'll circle back to you and let you just kind of drive down into it. But, another name that we've got bolded here is Zach Evans, 9 carries, 24 yards and a touchdown. And, we know he's returning from injury, right? He got pulled out last week from an injury, but 9 for 24 and a touchdown pales in comparison to what Quinshon Judkins did, 15, 106 yards and a touchdown. And this is where it's hard, because there's a few explanations involved, right? Is this a talent thing? Is this a guy who's fitting the offense better? Is this an injury thing? What's going on there? And I don't know that we're going to come out of this with a good answer, but it's something you absolutely have to pay attention to.
Yeah. And listen, I'm at the forefront of saying college statistics, I don't think really matter too much in the eyes of NFL evaluators. I know it's the analytic people will strongly disagree with that take, but I just think I follow the NFL draft close enough, and I've been doing it for long enough to know I don't really think they care too much about what players do. They're more trait based, and when they get them on the whiteboards and the meetings and talking to people. But at the same time, we don't see running backs go in the first round or top 40 or top 50 who don't put together a pretty strong all-around profile. That includes stats, right? So now Zach Evans, I think a lot of people thought he had a real chance to be RB2 in this class, and a real chance to be maybe not a first rounder, but in that mix to be a top 10, top 15 pick in round 2, kind of where we saw Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall go, where we've seen guys like J.K. Dobbins and Taylor and that draft class, Cam Akers, right? Like in that mix. But now he never put that together at TCU. He had flashes, but he never carried a heavy workload to put this monster. So we thought this year was set up. Kiffin likes to ride his running backs, make them the focal point of the offense, and he does. And we're seeing Judkins do that when Judkins is on the field, but we haven't seen it for Evans. So now, like, if this kind of morphs into a dual backfield, if this injury lingers in any way, I don't know how anybody can look as good as the metrics might be when he gets to the combine or pro day. Like, it's hard to look and say, look what Jahmyr Gibbs is doing. Look at what A-Chain's metrics are going to be. And he's showing he can handle a heavy workload. We'll see if he can hold up the whole year. Well, it's hard to think, Zach Evans is going to be more highly regarded than Bijan or Gibbs or A-Chain if they continue to do what they're doing and he's kind of doing what he's been doing and not breaking out, not having that monster year that we thought. We see Judkins doing it. I think we were all expecting these games. And again, maybe it's just the injury, but they haven't even been there even when it wasn't the injury yet. We're still seeing bits and pieces of a really talented player, but we haven't seen him put it together. And running back is usually one of the ones, if you're going to go high in the NFL draft, usually you put it all together. You have a great collegiate profile. You test pretty well. Like, it's hard to go high in the draft as a running back. You got to put together a Kenneth Walker type year. You got to have a great athletic profile. Like, to go really high, you need either all of them or one be really stand out. And right now, I'm not sure Evans is on the trajectory to go where we thought he might be headed towards, prior to this year. And now Judkins is just going to be a thorn in his draft stocks, side, I think, for the whole year, because you're not putting the genie back in the bottle. I mean, Judkins is good. He's very good. So, like, I don't think Zach Evans being the focal point, 20 carry, 25 carry, 30 carry a game type guy, I'm not sure we're going to get a chance to see that now. And then what does that do to his draft stock?
Yeah, the narrative doesn't look good, right? I mean, you didn't really blow up at TCU, and then you transfer and you have a few good games against inferior competition, but now you get outshined by a freshman. I mean, I look at Zach Evans and I know he's got talent. Like, I put him in that realm of that, right around pick 40 to 50, kind of Kenneth Walker, Joe Mixon, J.K. Dobbins. Like, that's the type of player that I think and the type of draft stock I think he could realistically achieve. And I thought he could be, with a great year, challenging, Bijan Gibbs for really, somebody in that tier. But it doesn't look good. And, we do have to also highlight, he's had off-field concerns too. It's just, that's just another thing that he's not forcing teams to say, we have to invest in this guy and we can't miss out on him. I think that's a tough one. I don't know if this actually will end up resulting in his stock slipping, because, again, I don't think his play has slipped at all. But that's something to be. We talked about putting your ear to the ground for guys like Jaren Hall and what the NFL thinks about him. It's one of those things where it's not just watch how Evans is playing and see what he's doing kind of on the box score. It's another ear to the ground moment. Why don't I just I hit rapid fire here with Ainias Smith with it went under the radar. I don't think I heard it anywhere else, but as I'm looking at where's Smith in the box score here, he got a leg fracture last week versus Arkansas, and he's out for the season. So I'm really curious, does this mean he's coming back? I thought he has a chance to be one of the top wideouts, especially when everybody else is had a very quiet year. I thought he could come out and be a very Josh Dotson-like prospect for the NFL. I don't know that we'll be able to see that this year, and it certainly feels like even day 2 could be a stretch, but it's not like a lot of other receivers are really making their case for it. Again, Kayshon Boutte, 1 for 4. Jermaine Burton, 1 for 14. Quentin Johnston, 4 for 41. I mean, these are quiet games. The only thing that's sort of really saving this draft class at wide receiver are our slot wide receivers, where Jordan Addison had another big game, 8 for 105. Josh Downs had a big game, another big game, after having 4 touchdowns in the prior 2 weeks, 8 for 120. Jacob Cowing, 12 for 180 and 1. And Zay Flowers, even with Boston College, had a massive game himself, 5 for 151 and 2, and adding some production on the ground too. Where do you want to go with this? Is there anything you want to touch on for Ainias Smith? Where slot receivers are outshining our sort of outside guys, and we know it's a new NFL. I'm very curious about what you think about maybe some of the players, if you want to key in on 1 or 2 of them, but even just, I find this fascinating from an expectations on the NFL draft at the wide receiver position too.
Yeah, so let's start with Ainias Smith first, because I do think Just from my early impression was the NFL community wasn't as high on Ainias Smith as I was and as you were. But I do think that a strong year this year, I kept saying, could he have that late breakout? Because he's always been talented, but he hasn't really had a monster year. I thought he was maybe going to have like the Kadarius Toney trajectory of great final season in college, kind of ride that momentum, great Senior Bowl, pre-draft process, and maybe be in the mix to be, a top 50 pick. But I didn't get the impression after I did my scouting over the summer, when then I like to kind of see what's out there. You didn't see Ainias Smith in too many people's top fives, or nobody's top fives, not really anybody's even top tens. So I don't think he was in that mix right now. So I feel like that's probably 100% off the table. I think he needed a really strong year to kind of push his way into that mix. So now I think if he comes out, you're probably talking, and I do think he'll probably come out. He's already a senior. I doubt he red shirts and goes back. He had some off the field thing. It got cleared up, but it still was out there. So I'd be surprised if he goes back to school again, because then if he gets another injury. So my guess is he kind of throws his hat into the mix. The injury's early enough in the year that maybe he's a full go by the time like the real heart of draft. I don't know. We've seen things, turnarounds and times now. Is a leg fracture less serious than an ACL and an Achilles? I mean, we're seeing guys come back in Achilles in 8 months. ACLs are tremendous. The speed at which guys come back in the ACL now is like 6 months. So I don't know where a leg fracture kind of fits in. It probably sounds like it would be less, even though it's a broken leg, but I feel
Bones
like,
heal. I found that one out. Bones
yeah.
heal. Ligaments, that stays with you.
Yeah, so I think my guess is, yeah, he's out the year, but my guess is he could even be a full go maybe by the combine in March. Like I don't know if that's out of the realm of possibility. Maybe a Senior Bowl or an All-Star game might be pushing it, but maybe the combine in early March is a shot, or definitely a pro day in April. So I think he probably now is more of a day 3 type guy, but he'll definitely be one of my day 3 type guys that, listen, I thought Wandell was going to be a day 3 type guy, right? I still kept him, I had him as like number 7 wide receiver. I'm not moving Ainias Smith out of my top 10 just because he's been there all along. I think this is a down class, and I think he's still, one of the best movement. He's got one of the best movement, skills in this class, and I'm intrigued by him. So I'll still like him, but I think it hurts his draft stock. And for sure, I think probably to day 3, you brought it all up. This wide receiver class is not living up to expectations. And then the slot guys are, but again, I think it's becoming harder and harder because schemes can be created to create space for slot guys. We see college statistics very gaudy from the slot position. NFL college teams aren't putting their best corners inside. NFL defenses schemes are starting to do more of that at times, right? But in college, I don't really think like those guys are like outside. The top corners mostly play on the outside. So you could hide guys, you can move guys inside. I don't think we're seeing as much top level corners go inside and guard the 5'9" slot receiver too often. So I think part of it is they're being matched up, in advantageous situations. They're being schemed, and then they're just like their quickness and stuff. Just for who they're matched up against, it's just too hard for some of these guys. Like guys can't stay with guys like Josh Downs and Jake McCowan, and we're seeing Zay Flowers really put together the year I think people thought he was going to have last year. So the slot receivers are strong. But I do think part of it is the environment that they're in. Part of it is the offensive scheme. Part of it is the lack of quality nickel corners at the collegiate level. But where it kind of morphs itself into is I don't know what it does in terms of the NFL draft, because what we thought we had a couple prototypical outside X receivers in Butte and Burden and Quinton Johnston. And, those guys are doing nothing so far this year. Like, again, I get that it's a traits-based league and they draft players on traits. And even when we were talking about Zach Evans, We were talking about Zach Evans being a top 50 pick. He's not going to fall out of he's not going to fall out of round 3 probably if he declares, because we saw guys like Tyrion Davis Price go in round 3. Like, Zach Evans is enormously more talented than a player like that. But we're talking, for Zach Evans, we were talking top 50. For guys like Burden and Quinton Johnson and Boutte, we were talking first round. So they're not living up to the expectations. And then with the success of guys who've came into the league, smaller players, does it open the door for guys like Addison and Downs to go even higher than maybe we thought they could go? I think it's legitimately a real possibility, because we're seeing these guys just not have the years. I mean, every week, I feel like TCU is putting together these great offensive performances, and I look at the box score if I'm out watching that game, and I'm kind of expecting 8-150 and 2 from Johnston, and it's never there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you're there, and I do feel like there's more need in the NFL for these outside wide receivers. I feel like we've got a lot of good, slot players, lining up out there, and a lot of teams, offensive teams, are scheming, are learning from the college game and scheming some of their best players into the slot, right? Like, we've seen guys, like DJ Moore kind of got, when he was used well, find his way in there. So it is pretty fascinating, and I do think team needs will really. That's the hard thing with wide receivers. It's not just one position. They're very different positions, and they're almost, it's almost too different that it's really about what the team needs are. And I think that could really potentially open the door for more running backs, especially when we talk about guys like McIntosh or Corum or Vaughn, who can be more weapons for teams. Maybe they find their way into, the top 100, where, wide receiver just has been somewhat disappointing. And one last thought on Ainias Smith, like you mentioned, like maybe that's a day 3 pick now. That was kind of in my gut reaction as well, but he will be my Mo Ibrahim at the wide receiver position, because this is a player I love his play. It's just, it's a little bit heartbreaking to see him, potentially lose out on a bit of draft stock. Let me just do a rapid fire here. I did promise a couple watch list names, and I'm just going to hit the names here. Jordan Travis at quarterback, Florida State. He's one that I've seen while watching others. Hunter Lupke out of North Dakota State. I've noticed his box scores really flashing lately. He's extremely productive. Kendre Miller is on his second big game in a row, stepping in for Zach Evans' shoes at TCU. Kalen Laybourne at Marshall. When I looked at, Chase Brown leading FBS in rushing, he's number 2, and he even had a good game against Notre Dame. So this isn't just cupcake competition there. So that's eyes I need to get on him, as well as a guy named Xavier Valade out of ASU. I noticed him on the USC game. I'm going to run to a quick Devy Slant too, because we have a few names to really hit on the NFL side of things. And there's one name I really wanted to highlight. We have the same players doing the same things: Caleb Williams, Drake May, Xavier Worthy. You got good names there. I've heard more buzz lately about JJ McCarthy out of Michigan. And so that's a name that it wasn't any gaudy stats, but that's one name I'm looking forward to taking a peek at, just seeing what he's got, and maybe starting to profile the growth. We've talked a lot about Raheem Sanders, but he had a good game versus Alabama. So it's just one thing to note that the production is even there against the top competition. I'll just touch quick on Dorian Singer. He's emerging as a number 2. Every time I go watch Jacob Cowing, he comes and flashes a few plays every game. And he's starting to, really step up and dominate for, the Arizona wide receiver core. But a guy that we talked a little bit about last week, who had another pretty good game this weekend, is Jaydn Ott out of Cal, right? Another West Coast guy. Maybe I'm a little biased for the best coast here, but 16 carries, 69 yards, and a touchdown, 7 for 41 through the air. He's a true freshman. He's out there trying to make plays with the limited snaps and limited opportunities he gets. But he really hit the radar because the previous week he had essentially a Reggie Bush game: 19 carries, 274 yards, and 3 touchdowns. I mean, And when you watched it, he flashed every single trait you want out of an elite running back as a freshman. If Jaydn Ott is not one of your top 2 or 3 freshman running backs for Devy, and not one of your top 10 Devy running backs in general, including, I would say, a few of the names from this upcoming 2023 class, you're sleeping on him a little bit. So he's really got to be on your radar. He's a must grab wherever you can get him. He's a priority player because we're going to see some electric playmaking out of him. Anything you want to add before we jump over to the NFL side of things, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one thing you kind of mentioned there with McCarthy out of Michigan is that scheme and offense doesn't really enable the quarterback to, I think, put up like the gaudy stats that we sometimes see in college. So I do think watching McCarthy and his development there, it'll be interesting because I don't think it's his Harbaugh's nature, right? Like, we'll see him run Blake Corum 30 times, right? We'll see them pound the football, play good defense. It's not really in their DNA to, play the arcade style up and down the field. So I think with a guy like McCarthy, it's going to be interesting because it's going to be more about really how does he manage the game? What does he do in big moments? And then the traits that he possesses that we see in spots, because it's not going to be one of those guys that jumps out at a box score. It's not going to be, the 400 yards, 4 touchdown type games. They're just not going to, Michigan quarterbacks aren't going to put games up like that unless they really, get in a situation where it's a real shootout or something. But that's not going to be what we see as the focal point of that. So he's an
kind of like the
interesting
Notre Dame quarterbacks too, right? It'll be in despite of the program, not necessarily because of it.
Exactly. So it doesn't mean he can't be a highly regarded prospect. It doesn't mean he can't be a first round quarterback at some point, but it just means that like our expectations for him, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying, like statistics are very misleading in college. It's not apples to apples, whether it's based on the level of competition, whether it's based on the scheme that they run, what they're asked to do. Like, it's very hard to look at statistics in college and see the whole picture without a lot of context. And I think that is going to be needed as we evaluate McCarthy over the years and we see him kind of morph into, a draft caliber prospect, to understand that we can't compare his touchdowns and his yardage totals to other guys in college because they're not going to look like CJ Stroud. They're just not, right? And maybe if they get in a game against Ohio State and he's pushed to the, he's kind of, they get pushed a little bit, then maybe we'll have to see him get an opportunity in that. But those are going to be very few and far between.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. Why don't you spearhead us through NFL here, especially on the rookie report?
Sure. So, we'll start again with the 2-minute drill kind of thing. Damien Pierce continues to look good. I mentioned the name before, but 100% rush share, more targets than Rex. That first week where it looked like they just maybe didn't trust him for whatever reason, he looks like now he's solidified that backfield role. Rashad White is starting to take over a little bit more work in the Bucs backfield. I think they understand that Leonard Fournette, especially at his age, can't be playing 86, 87% of the snaps. And it looked like last night that they just were given whole series to Rashad White. And even if they went down to they're in the red zone or at the goal line, they weren't bringing Fournette in. It was Rashad White's series. So I think that's promising for Rashad White. If Leonard Fournette was to go down this year, I think you're talking about a legitimate guy who could be a league winner in like a redraft setting. But I think we're starting to see him get a little bit more comfortable with Tom Brady. And I think you could envision down the line him being a guy who's very fantasy viable, mixed with that running and receiving capabilities. I still think his receiving capabilities will be his bread and butter, but he also has the size to at least be a functional runner. But I think his pass catching will be where, it really, he really shines. I would still say buy low on James Cook. They're right now, they're giving Devin Singletary a really heavy workload, and everything they've ever done prior to this year says that's not really ideally what they want. They tried to make Zach Moss a thing again this year. He just isn't. Buffalo's offense has kind of been ho-hum the last 2 weeks. Part of that's weather this past week. Last week was a weird game with Miami, but at the same time, they wanted Cook. They invested high in Cook. I just think it's a matter of when, not if, he becomes a little bit bigger role. And then Treylon Burks, we got to watch the injury. He started to run the most routes in that Titans wide receiver group with Robert Woods, but now turf toe. That is sometimes something that could be really, a nuisance for a long period of time, especially for a receiver. So that might sideline him for a while. So those are the quick things. The more thorough guys I wanted to go into, Kenny Pickett was named the starter moving forward. He took over for Mitchell Trubisky yesterday, 10 of 13, 120 yards. Somehow his 3, non-completions were all interceptions. He had 2 rushing touchdowns. We saw the highs, we saw some lows. But I think the intriguing part of him is understanding, put him out there. He offers more to the pass catchers. I think he's going to be a guy who's going to have some spiked weeks because of those pass catchers, especially with Pittsburgh not having as good of a defense this year as they've had, in the past. It looks like he's got a connection with George Pickens already. You saw that yesterday. So I think, Kenny Pickett / George Pickens is a duo to keep an eye on. I think Pickett being inserted into the lineup is also a positive for George Pickens there as well. I have my doubts that Pickett could ever be more than a high level QB2 and maybe probably settle in as a mid QB2 or low QB2, but he's got the weapons around him. Let's see what he can do. They weren't going anywhere with Trubisky. It was time to get the rookie in there. So I'm glad that happened. Breece Hall just continues to take a larger share of the pie in that Jets backfield. And, I updated all my dynasty ranks. If you're a premium subscriber, I think how high you start pushing Breece Hall now is a legitimate question, because Javonte Williams out the year. The rest of this year is a lost year, and then he's got to come back. And, it wasn't just the ACL. They said there was a couple of issues in the knee, and he's never been a bell cow anyway. So it's like, we're already seeing Breece Hall handle more bell cow duties than Javonte Williams did ever at his time in Denver or even in college. So I bumped Breece Hall over Javonte Williams. He's been bumped over some of the older guys like Kamara, who I think are starting to a little bit, to be concerned about some of these guys. So I think Hall's on the rise. And then Romeo Doubs, he's building that chemistry with Aaron Rodgers. He's seeing a playing time bump, even with Watson back. Utilization looks good. He's a guy that they're doing some of those back shoulder type things that Rodgers and Devontae Adams, were always in sync with. It looks like Doubs might be the guy he starts to have that comfort level with on some of those back shoulder throws. Doubs would be a guy that I'd be buying right now, still people. And I'm not usually a guy who's looking to buy day 3 guys, but Doubs is a guy who I liked in college. And I kind of feel like he's the guy that's earning Aaron Rodgers' trust. So he'd be a guy that I'd be intrigued with. And one last name, and then Jeff, I'll open it up if anybody you want to touch on or expand upon. Sky Moore, I watched the game last night. He's slowly starting to see his snap percentage increase. I think last night it was 28 or 30%. Juju Smith was down a little bit. Mecole Hardman's was down a little bit. So I think we're still a ways off of him being fantasy viable. But I do think we're starting to see him eat in a little bit into, other people's playing time and giving him the opportunity to rise there in the Kansas City wide receiver depth chart. So, Jeff, any thoughts on anybody I either hit on either in the 2-minute drill or Pickett, Hall, Romeo Doubs? I think those are the things that probably stood out from the rookies this past weekend.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just kind of share first with Breece Hall. Like I think I redid my dynasty ranks too, and I think I just need to copy them to the new version of the 2023 version of the rankings notebooks. But Breece Hall's number 7 for me, and it's utilization that we want to see. And even though it doesn't take away anything from Carter, but when you have someone we talked about it with Quinshon Judkins, especially when your competition is also talented and you're taking touches away from them, it means more to me. Kenny Pickett, I want to touch on. I mean, I think it's great to see the chemistry with George Pickens, and Pickens had a 100-yard game. So I think that's great to see, and I think there's going to be some growing pains. I'm with you though. When we came in, we did his profile, his rookie profile. I think you know, whether it was Mac Jones or Kenny Pickett, it was kind of the same sort of story as, you know, what is he going to be, you know, good Andy Dalton? Is he going to be bad Kirk Cousins? You know, let's just say Mac Jones is on the trajectory to sort of Kirk Cousins. I think that kind of leaves Kenny Pickett as our sort of maybe good, okay to good Andy Dalton type player. And I mean, I'm sure he's more talented than I ever am. So I, you know, take the challenge on and prove me wrong. I'm all about that. But I just, my expectations for it are a lower ceiling player at the NFL level. The one thing I really like is it's a stable organization, and you're not just investing in the players, you're investing in the organizations. We saw it with Trevor Lawrence when it was Urban Meyer. It didn't matter how generational of a prospect you had. When there's a dumpster fire around you, there's nothing you can do to transcend that. And when there's a pristine organization around you, for Kenny Pickett, you're going to have the wind at your back, and you're going to have every affordance, you know, to really reach your potential. So that's the thing to hang your hat on with Pickett in my mind. You know, yeah, Romeo Doubs, look, even with Christian Watson back, and I had some major Christian Watson concerns, I didn't think Romeo Doubs would be emerging at the level that he is now. At least what we're seeing, I think is a pleasant surprise. And I think it is worth buying into.
Yeah, I mean, I think this year's going to be interesting because I'm usually a little gun shy about day 3 guys, but Pierce and Doubs are 2 guys that are making me believe a little bit on the earlier side, and maybe, you know, getting burned a little bit about being so resistant last year to how high and how much I was willing to buy in on Amon-Ra. And I still think he's an extreme outlier. And I think more times than not being in on day 3 guys will benefit you than it will hurt you. But I do think these are both unique scenarios where Houston has a lot of holes. I'm not sure they're going to be ready to invest in a premium free agent dollars or premium draft pick in a running back. Now, it is an amazing class, as we've alluded to. So could I see them fitting one of those type guys like Deuce Vaughn or Blake Corum or Devin A-Chain to pair with Damien Pierce in day 2? Yeah, for sure. So we'll see about that. And Romeo Doubs, like if Aaron Rodgers comes back and plays another year, Green Bay might just keep throwing more assets at that wide receiver position, kind of like to appease him, and just because they know that they probably need it. So that does make it a little scary, especially if they want to go out. You know, money wasn't the reason why they lost Davante Adams, right? If you follow it closely, it sounded like Davante Adams just wanted out and he wanted Vegas. So it's not like they weren't willing to pay him the money so they could also be in the free agent mix. So it is a little bit of a dicey proposition, but I'm not also an Allen Lazard guy. So even if they went out and got somebody else, to me, it doesn't mean that Romeo Doubs can't be a really good number 2 in Green Bay. Maybe not a number 1, which I don't think anybody should be looking at him. I think you should be looking at him as maybe a wide receiver 4, 5 right now with some wide receiver 3 upside at times. And I think that's where you probably kind of value him, you know, even in dynasty circles. And if you can get him for like, you know, I don't know, maybe probably can't get him for like a mid or late second round rookie pick right now, but kind of see the ebbs and the flows of this year. If Christian Watson has a big week or 2 at some point and Doubs is quiet, I think that could be a little bit of a buying window there for sure. So let's take this to the Dynasty Stock Report to kind of end the night. And all my focus was on wide receivers. So let me bring up some names here, Jeff, and then kind of, you talk through a little bit of this. The first one is Rashad Bateman. And this is an interesting one because Rashad Bateman he has some stats this year, but they've been on like a few big plays, which not really what I thought his calling card would be. And then I think it's kind of got lost in the shuffle because he's had those touchdowns and those big plays, is that he hasn't been playing what you would expect a number one wide receiver, right? Number one wide receivers played the good majority of the snaps, high snap percentages. And Bateman's has been like not nearly what you would expect. And then this week, the playing time went down again. After the game, John Harbaugh was asked if it was an injury or performance related, and he had some weird answer was, I don't know. We'll have to look at the film, which basically was saying it wasn't injury related, because if it was an injury, he probably would have said some general injury issue. So yeah, I mean, they're playing like Demarcus Robinson, they're playing guys like Duvernay, like these guys are getting like snap percentages at or better than Bateman, which seems really weird. So like there's definitely a little something going on, I think, that we're not privy to, kind of not different, but also not completely different, where we know that even when Kadarius Toney was healthy, there was some other stuff behind the scenes that we just aren't aware of. There's got to be some other things behind the scenes, whether it's work ethic. I mean, listen, we went through this last year with Brandon Ayuk too, right? There's things that we just aren't privy to, that, there has to be something else going on with why Bateman is not playing almost 100% of the snaps as their main wide receiver there. So I just thought it was interesting. It could be a little bit of a buy opportunity, because I am still a believer in him, and a lot of really good people are, including, Matt Harmon loves him, and a lot of people do. So I thought it was at least noteworthy to bring up that his playing time's been down. CeeDee Lamb, ever since we started talking about him, is maybe he's not warranted being as high as we had him. He's kind of turned it on with weirdly with Cooper Rush and not Dak Prescott behind there, but he's starting to morph into the alpha, clear top level wide receiver. So that's good to see. So I think he's right there back in the mix after the first couple wide receivers in Dynasty. Gabe Davis hype has slowed a little bit, whether it's been injury related. I don't think I'm ready to be concerned yet. I do think that the slow start to the year, I would maybe take that opportunity to buy him. I want to be attached to that offense, and I think he's shown enough big moments where I think he's going to get every opportunity to be the long-term wide receiver 2 there. So he's interesting. And then Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, their value has not been impacted much, if at all, by Geno Smith. They might even be throwing the ball more now, I think, with Geno Smith, which is really ironic, and might say something about Russ Wilson. But I do think there might need to be some review of where people dropped Lockett and DK in their rankings, because I do think people might have overvalued and I know I did too. So I have fixed it a little bit, and I have gotten DK back into, let me see where I put him. I got DK back into, I have him now back into my top 12. So back into being a clear wide receiver 1. He had dropped a little bit out of that for me. And I think I was a little too overly worried. And even Lockett, I think he's more of a redraft guy, but obviously still in Dynasty, so exists. Even him, I dropped too far. So I don't think I'm the only one that reacted that way with the loss of Russ Wilson, with Geno Smith / Drew Lock, the quarterbacks in play for this year. So I do think there might need to be some corrections in order on people's rankings of the Seahawks receivers, because it looks like they're going to be just fine, even with the likes of Geno back there.
Yeah, look, that story, Seattle quarterback, Denver quarterback, it is one of the most fascinating ones, I think, of the NFL storylines this year. And I don't think it necessarily is highlighting maybe a talent discrepancy between those two guys that might not be as big as what we once saw. I think it has a lot more to do with, the way that Seattle wants to play is a very scripted offense. It's very kind of almost Kyle Shanahan-like, right? Where, we want you to manage the game and we'll win it as a team versus, and, that's not the recipe that you can solely rely on to win Super Bowl championships. We talk about that with like the Josh Allen, Pat Mahomes game, right? You need players that'll win games, not just coaching and talent and schemes. That said, you know, it actually looks like Seattle is in some level of competency for this year, way more than we expected. And I think you're right. I have Lockett and DK closer than most will for dynasty ranks. I mean, there's still a good 30 spot gap, but I think that production is going to look similar between the both of them. It's just that DK has a little bit of the more freak nature and he's got the youth on his side. You know, I think with CD Lamb, while we were talking last week, what we didn't get the chance to see was all those drops, right? We didn't, he's still getting the utilization that I kind of expected going in with all the targets, but his level of play isn't that of what you expect from a guy like Justin Jefferson. He's not in that tier. From a fantasy lens, he might be. But when I'm nitpicking and nitpicking hairs to get into that elite level 0 top tier no-brainer, you've really got to stand out as some of the best of the best. Let me touch quickly once on Bateman, and then I'll kind of move over to the Buffalo situation. The one thing I did see today somewhere on the newswire was that Bateman is coming through with a midfoot sprain or a midfoot issue. And that is definitely something that could limit the effectiveness and the availability of a wide receiver. Playing through it would be pretty monumental effort. Though that's not something that'll just magically get better if you keep playing on it. So we could be looking at potentially significantly reduced fantasy production this year, especially if those snaps don't go over 70, 80%. But I do think what we're seeing is the talent show through, right? I mean, I think one of his big plays was a slant that was, partially on Lamar for placing it exactly where it needed to be, but partially on him to pull out stops that we just didn't think that we'd see at the NFL level. But I think what you're seeing is he's a buy for the long term. It just might might not emerge out of the blue, out of nowhere to a superstar level, like what we might be seeing with guys like Olave or London or Jefferson and whatnot. Let me circle back to Buffalo, to close it out before I give you any parting thoughts. But I had, and you and I talked a lot about this leading into this draft season, but I mean, I'm always a fan of UCF players. So Gabe Davis, like he's got a spot in my heart, but the hype got kind of out of control there. I mean, we saw a 4-touchdown game, but so much of his production is because of the team around him, especially Stephon Diggs, just gives him so much openings. And that's something to be mindful of. But I don't think we're talking about a guy like T. Higgins who's earning it on his own right. And that's something that we have to be wary of, especially because, and we've seen it year in and year out, even with Josh Allen with Buffalo, the slot role in Buffalo is a very important role. And we're seeing, I was even looking at it this morning, they have the slot role, actually not even the slot role, just Isaiah McKenzie has more targets than Gabe Davis on the year, even if you do it per game basis with Davis's missed game. And then if you factor in the slot role with Crowder out for the year and now McKenzie probably getting all those snaps, the slot role has significantly more targets. They use that role as a weapon, and it's not just going to funnel to Gabe Davis because we want it to. And so I was in this season on, I was hedging with Crowder, but I was in this season on Isaiah McKenzie because he is a very dynamic playmaker. Like he will hit splash plays for them. And that's, again, we look at that Kansas City game and we say, what do you need? You don't need somebody to get, 6 yards on 1st and 10, keep you on script. Like you need somebody who's going to turn like a Deebo Samuel or like a Tyreek Hill. You need someone who's going to turn a slant into a touchdown or a swing pass or a screen or just get down the sideline or get lost in the defense. And that's the type of play like Isaiah McKenzie can do. And so he's notably higher in my rankings. And I think I just would preach a little bit of caution on buying too far into Gabe Davis. I want in on the pieces, but I want in on the pieces without having to pay an over, a pretty high price. And so I personally would go for the cheaper ones.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense. I do think there's enough to kind of appease everyone. They don't throw to the tight ends a lot. Anybody in New York is also seeing that. Just I know Dawson Knox could get some touchdowns, but they're just not going to be a heavy target. I think right now so much is funneling through the running backs. Is that sustainable? I think it'll probably shift a little bit more back towards the wide receivers, and that'll kind of fall. I think some more of that work will end up Gabe Davis's way, but I think like you talked about McKenzie, he's locked in because that slot role is super important. We saw it last year. We saw once Brian Dable came to New York how important they valued that slot thing, and they targeted, Wan'Dale Robinson to play that role. So that role is going to be important. I do think now his stock is falling a little bit, Gabe Davis. So I do think there might be a window where maybe you can buy a little bit lower now that 4 touchdown game is plenty in the rear view mirror. People aren't buying, people aren't making decisions, I think, so much on that anymore. We're now 4 weeks into the year. He missed one game. He came back, whether he's playing with injury or not, we don't really know. I know he's playing every snap, so he's out there, but he hasn't seen a lot of targets. He hasn't seen much besides that first game where he was productive. So it's interesting to follow. And, we'll keep a close tabs also on 2 running backs, and maybe we'll bring them up next week, is Miles Sanders and Josh Jacobs, who are kind of in that running back dead zone, are playing their best football of their careers. So it's going to be interesting to kind of talk about them and from the dynasty perspective. So we'll revisit them next week. Jeff, we'll make sure we kind of put them on our radar. Vegas didn't pick up that option, so it opens up to the unknown a little bit, and I think that makes his dynasty value even harder to kind of peg because we don't even know, like, oh, he at least has one more year of being maybe an integral part of that offense. It's a complete unknown, and where he ends up. And even Miles Sanders, right? Kent Gainwell is slowly getting a little bit of work. Jalen Hurts is there. Great passing offense now with A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. But I do think they warrant a conversation because they're playing the best football of their careers. So we will revisit those 2 running backs. Tonight's Dynasty Stock Report really honed in on the wide receivers. Jeff, any final thoughts before we call it a night?
Yeah, well, both those running backs are free agents. And one final thought was you talked about just the importance of the slot role and Dayball, going to New York and drafting Wan'Dale Robinson. And hey, I mean, it just circles back to, when our very first segment, and we're talking about, okay, well, we may not have really good outside profile wide receivers, but look at these slot guys. And I know people like Khalil Shakir and I like Isaiah McKenzie, but goodness, could you imagine one of these dynamic draft eligible 23 slot wide receivers going to Buffalo? I think that's something that people get really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be fun to follow for sure. So on behalf of Jeff, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nicano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.